Welcome to the final word on life cycle perspective and the ISO 14001 standard. Many organizations still struggle with identification of aspects from a life cycle perspective and frankly understanding what this life cycle perspective entails. As well as many auditors I talk to. They talk about the end of life of your cardboard, and that's not what the standard or this requirement applies to. So in section 6.1, it says we're going to identify aspects from a life cycle perspective. And in section 8.1, it says we are going to control our activities in each stage of the life cycle of our product. So let's start with the definition of life cycle that's included in the ISO 14001 standard. It says the consecutive and interlinked stages of a product. That's your product, or a service if you're a service organization, from raw material acquisition through final disposal. And if you read the note here, it says the life cycle stages include acquisition of raw materials, design, production, transportation, delivery, use, end of life, and final disposal of our product. Okay, so section 6.1.2, environmental aspects. This is the first place in the standard that talks about the life cycle perspective. And this section of the standard is all about the identification of aspects. So it says the organization shall determine the aspects of their activities, products, and services that it can control and those it can influence, and the associated impacts considering a life cycle perspective. So here, again, we're trying to just identify aspects, primarily from our activities, and it's our activities along the various stages of the life cycle that we have to first identify and then consider what the aspects related to those activities are. So here are the stages of the life cycle of our product, and depending on the organization, we may be design responsible or not. If not, we definitely design the processes to build the product and consider that through the quoting process as well. So what are the activities? Well, it could be product design, process design, selection of equipment, and it's these activities that can create environmental aspects. And the standard requires us to identify aspects from a life cycle perspective. So we look at design and process development. We look at our material acquisition, primarily through purchasing. We look at our activities in the production process, including facility management and outsourced services. We look at the packaging and transportation of our product, of our waste, etc. We look at the use of our product, and we look at the end of life or disposal of our product. And again, we only need to identify aspects that we are able to control or influence. Okay, so here is a couple of examples of products that we're familiar with, our computers or electronic devices and vehicles. And again, just a visual representation of the environmental impacts in the different stages of the life cycle of these products. So our electronics are made of a lot of metals, cadmium, chromium, lead, gold, silver, and the mining of those materials has an extensive impact on the environment. So it shows a very high impact relative to material acquisition. We produce the products, they're distributed. The customer uses the product, and then there's ultimately, hopefully these products are then recycled or recovered. The same with the vehicle. We've got a lot of materials there, some material acquisition impacts, a lot of production related impacts in the supply chain of a vehicle. Distribution, not so much, because we can load them up on rail cars and have them delivered. The use of the automobile, huge impact. That's where the automobile is consuming fossil fuels, emitting air emissions. Even those electric vehicles, they may be electric, but somehow that electricity got developed. And then the ultimate recovery or recycling of the vehicle. Again, another nice visual of the life cycle of a product. And this is a complete life cycle through the different stages. Talks about material supplier, provides materials to the material manufacturer, to the parts manufacturer, to the product manufacturer, to the sales company, ultimately to the user. And then you've got the maintenance company that maintains the product, and the various other portions of what's considered the full life cycle of a product. And this educational program is brought to you by EHS Management Strategies. Now, I'm not going to bore you here. If you want some more information on our company, you can go out to our website, www.iso14001-training.com, and appreciate you listening to this. So let's get back to basics. Again, we're in section 612, identifying aspects. And again, I continue to work with organizations that don't have a clear view or understanding of actually what an aspect is. So let's go back to the definition here. It's an element of your activity, your product, or your service that can interact with the environment. So again, goes back to the identification first of your activities, and then what is it about that activity, the element of that ultimately impacts the environment. Okay, so here's a good example. The activity is the storage of oil. When we store oil, we have to deliver oil, and we have to disperse oil from the tank. So potential aspects could be a leak or a spill from the tank. And then the impact would be ultimately land pollution, which would then become water pollution and then get into the lakes or streams there. So the activity would be oil storage. The aspect would be a potential leak or spill. The impact would be land pollution. Again, a pretty straightforward process here. So let's talk a little bit about how to identify aspects. The first thing you should do is take a look at your various activities, and to some extent your products, and you're not a service company maybe, but basically the activities that you perform. What are the aspects of those activities that may be impacting the environment, and then ultimately what is the impact? Is it air pollution, waste, or land pollution, or the consumption of natural resources? So a good example here would be we operate a compressed air system. One aspect of that would be the consumption of electricity. It consumes a lot of electricity. And then that impact would be the depletion of natural resources. And then further on, we'll talk about risk and opportunities. And one of the risks relative to operating that compressed air system is we could generate air leaks. And again, when we leak air, that wastes the compressed air and then ultimately causes higher consumption of electricity. So that would be viewed as a risk of that activity. So here's another approach that we've taken to identification of aspects, is to look at individual processes. And this example would be injection molding. Or the process could be product design, process design, purchasing, etc., etc. So you take a look at any of the processes that you have along the food chain of the life cycle perspective here. You look at the inputs to the process, via plastic resin, electricity, oil, mold release, new gloves, labor, etc. Hopefully you're going to output some good parts. You may output some air emissions, vaporization of that mold release, and then various waste streams could come from that process. So based on this input and output analysis, we want to strive to identify the aspects related to that activity. And here's an example of again, injection molding. A number of aspects related to it. We use oil, which is a depletion of a natural resource. We store it, which creates the potential for a spill or land pollution. We consume electricity, which is a depletion of natural resources. We consume plastic resin, which comes from petroleum oil, which is a natural resource. We dispose of gloves, which probably go to the landfill. We have some waste oil recycling, which is we're reusing the material, hopefully. We may be sending off our aerosol can or our aerosol can waste for incineration, which would create air pollution. Mold release emissions, again, pretty minor, but again, creating some air pollution. And then the recycling of scrap. Either we recycle it and we avoid the landfill, or we throw it away and create land pollution. So now what we want to do is take a life cycle perspective. We're going to look at our internal processes along the phase of the life cycle, whether it's product design, process design, material acquisition, the activities that we do or influence, we control or we influence activities, and then what are the associated aspects within each stage of the life cycle. And this is what it's talking about. Again, 612 is about identifying aspects from a life cycle perspective. Our aspects come from our activities, our product, and our services if we're a service company. And for all intents and purposes right now, we're going to focus on the aspects related to your activities. Again, whether it's in design, production, transportation, there are things that you guys do that you can control or you can influence that will impact the environment. When you look at the design for any product, whether it's automotive, furniture, electronic, there are a lot of decisions that get made through the design process that can ultimately impact the complete environmental impact of the product. We select the components, we select the materials. In an automotive design, the weight of the component is very important because it contributes to the total weight of the vehicle. I was at one company that designed headlight assemblies, and I talked to their head of design, and I said, what are the environmental design requirements for your product? He says, well, the first thing is the aerodynamics of the headlight assembly contributes to the aerodynamics of the vehicle, the weight of the headlight assembly, and then the power draw from the headlight assembly, because that influences the size of the alternator and the battery required for the vehicle. So I thought that was pretty informative. And within a lot of industries, this concept of designing for the environment or minimizing the environmental impact of a product through the design process is very prevalent, especially like in the furniture industry. Everybody's trying to prove how eco-friendly their products are, and they use a lot in their marketing. So here's some examples of activities that may occur during your product design or your new process design. The aspects that could be related to those activities, and then the ultimate impact of the aspect. So again, what does the standard require? It requires you to identify the aspects of your activities considering a life cycle perspective. So again, depending on your organization, you may or may not be design responsible for your product. And if you're not, that's okay. But you are responsible for the establishment of the process design to produce the component or the product. And there's a number of things that occur during that process. Maybe you do a tool design. And based on the life of the program and so forth, you make decisions on how to design that tool both to minimize the amount of scrap you could develop, optimize the manufacturing process, and that tool design actually has a very significant impact on the environment through the entire program of that component. So again, this is an example of some activities, some associated aspects and impacts. Once you guys identify the aspects in each of these life cycle stages, then you're going to evaluate their significance. So at this point, we're just trying to identify the aspects, demonstrate that we've considered the life cycle perspective of our product, and then later we will evaluate these aspects to determine which of those we feel are significant or pose a higher risk to the environment. Okay, let's talk a little bit about purchasing, material acquisition, and the aspects associated with those activities. Now, here's an example of just some different types of, we'll call them green purchasing initiatives, whether it's purchasing things with recycled content, whether it's specifying we want mercury-free or lead-free solder or products. We want to specify the energy efficiency of a piece of equipment or a component we're purchasing. We ask for certain packaging, which can influence how the materials are transported to us, and we try to optimize the transportation of those materials to us. Again, a lot of activity occurs here in organizations to save money. Okay, but common sense tells me anytime we save money, we've probably done something to help the environment. So when you optimize your transportation process, you minimize the number of vendors that you use, so you can consolidate shipping. Those are all things you might do in the light of trying to save money, but there are also things that help the environmental impact of your product. So again, next step here, look at your procurement process. What is the activity that we do? Are there aspects? What are the impacts? A big impact of purchasing is the selection of a supplier. Are we going to pick a responsible supplier? Do we expect them to have a quality certification? Do we ask them if they have an environmental certification? Basically, anything you purchase, you're inheriting the environmental footprint of that component as it goes into your product. So there are multiple impacts associated with that. Material selection. Do we have a choice to be able to increase the recycled content or the recyclability of our product? Packaging. Do we specify that we want expendable packaging versus returnable? If we have an option for returnable dunnage, is that something we can specify through our procurement process? Again, conflict minerals. We want to do our due diligence to make sure that what we're purchasing does not consume or support the use of conflict minerals. And these would be just a few examples of aspects related to procurement. And I always find it interesting when I sit down and talk to a purchasing manager and I ask them about the environmental impact of what they do. They often come up with many things that I'd never even thought about. So again, what does the standard require? Identify your activity, the aspect and impact, and then later we'll worry about how significant it is. Okay, so next is the identification of aspects related to the production processes in our organization. Most of you have been certified for many years and have been doing a very good job identifying the activities, the various departments you have, their activities, the associated aspects of those activities and impacts. And the prior version of the standard was really focused on what is it that we do inside of our fence line. The 2015 version of the standard requires us to consider what is it that we not only do, but what is it that we influence. So when we purchase things, we influence things. When we design things, there's some influence. So in the production process, we influence things like our facilities maintenance process and the contractors that they bring in, and they may do the work, but through our control of the contractors, we can actually influence the environmental impact of their activities. Okay, so what are the environmental aspects as related to the transportation of our product, transportation of our various waste streams to the disposal or recycling facilities, and back in purchasing, transportation of components to us. And again, it's the same thing, breaking down the activities that we do. Most of the aspects related to transportation are going to deal with the consumption of the diesel fuel and then the combustion of the diesel fuel. So that's both an air pollution and a consumption of a natural resource. With a lot of these trucks and so forth, we create a potential spill or leak aspect. If we're transporting hazardous waste and oils and so forth, the truck could experience some type of a spill or a leak. And then in the shipping and receiving docks, it's just amazing how often a truck backs in, they blow a coolant line, they blow a fuel line or hydraulic line, etc. And those are potentially impacting the stormwater on our site. And then there's the identification of environmental aspects associated with the use of our product and or the end of life or disposal of our product. While most of these are things that we have very little control or influence over, there are things that we can do that may influence the environmental impact of our product and its usage and ultimately its final disposal. Some companies like Hewlett-Packard have a toner return program where they're trying to encourage their customer to return their product so that they can reuse that toner cartridge responsibly. So that would be an example of a company using or having influence on the end of life or disposal of their product. In the design process, we can affect the environment in the usage of our product through the weight of the component, its aerodynamics, etc. So again, there aren't a lot of aspects here that we control or influence, but there may be a few things that you do that you could indeed add to your aspects list, and then consider the significance of that impact. Okay, now we've discussed how to identify aspects and associated impacts, how to look at the life cycle stages of our product, how we identify the activities associated with those stages of the life cycle of our product, and then how to identify the aspects related to our activities. Every organization, many have very different ways of looking at aspects and impacts, and one of the easiest things to do is, as you see in the example here, on the matrix itself, we created sections about each stage of the life cycle, and then tried to identify a few associated aspects. And again, this is just one methodology, but as you're audited, your environmental auditors are going to continue to say, ask the question, how did you consider the life cycle stages of your product when you identified aspects? And this is, again, just one way to do it. We've worked with a lot of different organizations to come up with different ways to present and demonstrate the life cycle perspective. But again, remember, it's all about how we identify aspects, nothing else. It's not the life cycle of our cardboard when we recycle it. That's not what the standard's talking about. And I still get to organizations that try to explain to me their life cycle perspective and how they recycle the oil and how they recycle their forklift batteries, and those are the life cycle, the end of the life cycle of those materials. That's simply not what the standard is asking us to do. The next section of the standard that uses the term life cycle perspective is 8.1 operations. And again, what they're expecting organizations to do is develop controls on their activities considering the life cycle stages of their product that they control or influence. So in 8.1, it says we're going to establish the environmental controls associated with, or environmental requirements associated with either the design of our product or product development. We're going to identify the environmental requirements for the procurement of goods and services. We're going to control or influence the environmental impacts of outsourced processes. If you outsource a painting of a part, heat treating, assembly, and any process that you outsource, how do you control the environmental impacts associated with that work? Contractors, how do we communicate our environmental requirements for contractors and the provider of services? So if you've got a janitorial service, do we specify the types of cleaning chemicals they can use, how they dispose of those things that they choose to recycle? In the transportation of our product and ultimately the use and disposal of our product. So in 8.1, it says we should consider the aspects that we identified in 6.1, and then we should determine how those activities are controlled or influenced. And again, those are the only two sections of the standard that mention life cycle perspective. So yes, I'm hoping that this is the final word on what it means to identify aspects from a life cycle perspective. I hope that this explanation helps you to understand the requirements of the standard, to understand what it is that the International Organization for Standardization, ISO, what are they wanting organizations to do? They're wanting them to look at the entire environmental footprint of their product or their service and be able to understand those activities, determine which of those are significant, to control those significant aspects, and any associated risk or opportunities to make those processes or impacts better. Again, as brought to you by EHS Management Strategies, our focus is primarily ISO 14000, 45000 management systems. We do a lot of compliance-related work, and we would love to be able to help support your environmental and ISO programs. As always, I tell people, if you have any questions, contact us. Questions are free. You can try to call. I may answer. You can text me. You can email me. Anytime that you've got a question related to ISO 14000 or 45000 and how to better integrate that, we'd love to have a brief conversation with you. If we've got a tool we can share with you, we'd love to do that as well. I definitely appreciate the opportunity to speak with you through this video. And again, I'm hoping that we've demystified this term life cycle perspective. It's very clear to you what the standard's asking you to do. And then as you go through your external registration audits, it will hopefully be easier for you to answer the questions that your external auditor is asking you. Thank you very much. And again, this is the last word on life cycle perspective.